To many people, antique furniture is a closed book. Well, in this series of 10 programmes, we shall be opening that book and telling the story of the development of English furniture, period by period, from its very beginnings to the present day. We're trying to show there's much more to furniture than meets the eye, and understanding more about it adds greatly to the pleasure of using it and having it in your own home. And also, being aware of some of the nuances of design and detail, you'll find it much easier to date furniture and to tell the difference between the original and the fake or the copy. And as each period goes by, we'll also be seeing something of the social and historical background as the skill of the English craftsman developed. And what better place could there possibly be to begin a series of programmes on English furniture than here in an English wood amidst the raw material, the oak. And deeper into the wood, there's beech and elm and ash and chestnut and holly, the very woods which were indigenous to this country and which the early craftsmen, the carpenters and joiners, used to practice and perfect their skills. And it was those skills that lay the foundation for the masterpieces in the golden age of English cabinet making. Well, all old furniture was, of course, once new, and before it could be made, trees had to be felled and sawn and split. And they would have used a sawpit such as this, in use indeed in the English countryside for centuries. Every community would have had one, and it was probably in constant use. And if hard labour requires definition, then this is probably it. Now, the top sawyer standing up here had little more to do than guide the saw through the wood. It was the poor bottom sawyer down there below in the pit who had to use all his muscle on the important downward cuts. There is indeed probably no single job in the whole furniture making process less enviable than that of bottom sawyer. It was hot, it was back-breaking, and he had the added unpleasantness of all the sawdust from the timber tumbling down on top of him. But of course, before you needed furniture to sit on or eat from, you had to have a roof over your head. And it was in the construction of timber frame buildings like this one that the first rules and skills of joinery, later to be used, of course, in the making of furniture, came to be acquired. And it wasn't long before a simple but highly effective method of joining timbers together evolved. And here we have a fine example of it. A tie beam and crown post joined together by means of the mortise and tenon, the male and the female, bound together naturally without use of glue or nails or any kind of foreign body. The mortise here in the horizontal and the tenon here in the upright. And as we shall see, this was the beginning of the art of the joiner, and whoever made this piece was a very effective joiner indeed, because it was cut out some 500 years ago and it still fits together perfectly. It's very difficult so long afterwards for us to imagine what life was like in medieval times. That is, until you find a door like this one into the past and walk through it. An earth floor, a central fireplace, a table for meals, a bench facing the fire with your back to the wall for support. The furniture in a medieval house such as this, probably made of oak, taken from trees which were grown undoubtedly not very far away. Well, perhaps the commonest form of early English furniture is a three-legged stool like this. It's splayed legs coping very adequately with the uneven floor, dowelled right through and pinned from the top. As popular now in design as it was 1,000 years ago. But perhaps the most useful piece of furniture in the medieval house was the chest. It was used for storage of all kinds at a time when security and keeping things dry must have been a constant problem. But it wasn't only used as a chest. It could be a table, a bench, or even a bed.
Hello. Well, I suppose I'm looking and you're looking at one of the earliest primitive forms of chests that one could find in this country, because it is nothing more than a tree trunk. You can see a tree trunk, it's been squared up a bit. You see in the end there a cross-section of the trunk of the tree, and you notice it's got wrought iron bands across it to sort of hold it together better. Notice also in the front, because this contained practically all a man had, 5 iron lock plates, necessary that all 5 people, for security reasons, were here at the same time when something needed to be removed. And I'll just show you what it looks like underneath. Great heavy log of wood, really, and that is the first type of chest called a dugout chest. But here is a pretty little article called an ark. Here, now you saw Hugh pick out the easy job on that saw pit. Well, this was made before saws, and these planks of wood here are what we call riven. That meant to say they were split. You can see they've all been split down this ray, which we call the medullary ray, which is perhaps better known as silver grain. And there they are. They've been split with a beetle and wedge. And you notice no ironwork on this at all. A pin hinge to revolve this cover, and the ends mortised right through and held with a little wooden peg. But that is an ark. You know, we use all sorts of names for these things. We call them chests and coffers and all sorts. But this one's got what we call slab ends. You notice, again, thick, not much construction about it, but we're very early. And you notice here in these very early ones, these huge, wide stile. This thing, although it goes right down to form the legs, the width of this is really quite enormous on a chest just that size. Here's a little more of a standard type. Now this type of chest was made right up into the 18th century. Who doesn't know these are salt boxes? And it's just interesting to show it's just made simply of planks. But here, really, for the first time, is a coffer. Now, we use this word coffer for anything these days, but this truly is a coffer. All coffers had arched tops, mainly to get rid of the wet, probably. They were all iron-bound, and iron-bound over leather. Here, obviously, the leather's all gone, but this is a beautiful example of what we call a trussing coffer, because with these heavy wrought iron handles, this carried a man's possession on horseback, more or less wherever he went. And so that's a nice article, all around about 1500 here. And coming up to 1500 here, 2 Gothic chests, one bit ordinary, one superb. Absolutely superb when you think of the age of this. In solid walnut, big thick top once more, beautiful carved panels in the front there, with the owner's probably heraldic device there below that wrought iron lock plate. But a rattling good chest that. And I keep on saying it, bear in mind the date, because it's no good going out looking for these. You won't find these bits. We should get to bits of furniture we're more used to seeing, like this. Now, this is the form every box or coffer now takes. It's usually got narrow stiles, you remember the wide ones over there, panelled fronts, carved, got mask heads, all sorts of things, carrier ties, trusses, all sorts of things. But basically, this is the form right through now onwards. And it's only recognising the different details. It's the detail of everything which allows one to date it. This box, this coffer, is standing back to front because it's most unusual, in my experience, to find one which is panelled all round. This one has been made to stand out in a room. This is the back. All the way around, just the same, these nice linen fold panels. Everyone knows what a linen fold panel is. Supposed to represent the folds of linen in an upright position. And here again you have these things, mortised and tenon and pinned, and the panels were put in with a little bit of play so that there was no warping when, as the thing expanded or contracted, so the panels could just move and be all right. Here's another funny little panel worth just showing there. See, linen fold again, all punched through with holes. And obviously this is from a food cupboard, an odd panel out of a food cupboard where it was necessary to punch holes all through the panel doors, all through the ends, in order to get some circulation of cold air to try and keep some of the food fresh. Well, there's a few examples of early chests. In fact, one might say very early chests, because you must remember that we're no farther advanced than about 1525 with this particular linen-fold one.
Well, a lot of this early English furniture was made for the church. The small parish churches, the great cathedrals, the monasteries and the nunneries. The church was a tremendous patron of those early English craftsmen, and as a result had a great influence on the design of early English furniture. Notice, for instance, no upholstery. Well, that doesn't appear for another 200 years or so into the 17th century. You see, upholstery was to provide comfort, and comfort, the ascetics thought, had no place in the worship of God. And so there was no upholstery in these early English pieces. Well, now, if you want to find one of the finest examples of early English furniture, it's hardly surprising that you would go to one of our great churches, to Wells Cathedral in Somerset, one of the finest expressions of medieval architecture to have survived in Britain, and a marvellous demonstration of the same Gothic style that we saw just now in some of those chests. And in among the impressive Gothic arches and columns, there's a massive 14th century fan-shaped oak chest. It was designed to hold the vestments, the copes of the clergy, which, when folded, formed the shape of a fan. And remarkably, 6 centuries later, it's still in use, serving the very same purpose there beside the Lady Chapel in Wells Cathedral. Well, now here's a little curiosity from those medieval churches. These, which were commonplace at the time, were known as misericords, and they were really a perch. They were made so that the elderly and the infirm could rest their bottoms in here, while at the same time having all the appearance of standing up. But they weren't just used by the elderly and the infirm. Many a lazy preacher perched on a misericord. And they're interesting to us today, not simply because of the stories that are told about them, but because of the enormous wealth and variety of the carving. And the craftsmen who were working for the church at this time saw all this not simply as an act of decoration, but as a real contribution to Christian worship. Now, there was at this time also a cross-fertilization between the ideas that were used in architecture and the ideas in furniture. And so the furniture reflects architectural ideas, the Gothic idea, summed up completely by this bench end or pew end, and so too in these timbers, which were originally part of a choir stool, and they date from about 1400. And this lectern over here is early too, but there's a problem about some of this furniture in saying precisely whether it's English or French. This could easily, for instance, have come out of a church in Normandy. There was a considerable amount of trade going on between ports on the south coast of England and the northern coast of Europe, France in particular, and that had been going on, of course, since pre-Roman times. But it was Henry VIII who did more than anybody to expand that trade. He was very keen on the idea of trade and commerce with the continent. He encouraged it, and as a result, one of the greatest influences of all came to bear on English craftsmanship. It was the Renaissance to have a most profound effect on everything that our craftsmen did. And these are a fine example of the sort of influences that were brought to bear. These medallion heads, which you found on wall panelling at the time, and they were also introduced into furniture. Over here, a good example of that. This chest dates from the time of Henry VIII. There is the medallion incorporated into it, pure Italian design influence, and that form of decoration became known as remain work. Well, now to move back in time very slightly to 1485 and the end of the Wars of the Roses. Now, that really is a date worth remembering, because wars, particularly civil wars, have a very unsettling effect on the whole process of art and design and invention. You see, people are uncertain about the future, uncertain whether they're still going to be around in a year or so's time. But once the Wars of the Roses were out of the way, then changes began to develop because people became more certain about the future. A new era of expansion and prosperity was beginning. There were changes not only in furniture, but also in our houses. Let's have a look at some of them. The medieval hall with its central hearth was giving way to long galleries with a variety of apartments opening off. And there were other changes too. Fireplaces with chimneys now became established in the wall, and by Elizabethan times the walls themselves were often decorated with panelling. Tapestries were another popular wall covering. The demand for more luxurious furnishings inevitably brought with it increasing variety. Chairs, cupboards, four-poster beds and dining tables all began to develop quickly. One feature that we particularly associate with the Elizabethan period came again from the continent, the bulbous turning which was introduced from Flanders. At first it was retained as the plain Flemish bulb, but it clearly provided the perfect vehicle for the English carver to practice his art, and the result was the development of the deeply carved cup and cover, as it's called. So, by the second half of the 16th century, English furniture, having absorbed so many design influences from abroad, was beginning to develop its own distinct identity.
That's quite true, Hugh, and as you know well, types of workmen were even quarrelling amongst themselves what they should do, like turners and joiners. Here is a stool, a nice Elizabethan stool. The usual turn legs that one finds on these joint stools, and bear in mind these are the first things that people sat on to eat off, but when you find one with nice big bold carving all around it, and these great carbuncles all around the frieze, then you can say, my word's a nice stool, because that is. And of course, as is generally known, there were really only stools in houses, very, very few chairs. Chairs like this, one or two, kept for the very VIP and his host, not much more. This is interesting because here is a big spray of flowers or a tree, in which you can clearly see has been dug out. Quite the opposite to market tree, which is laid on the top, but dug out, and these holes and these designs filled with bog oak and holly. And this one is very similar, not much difference in the date, smothered in carving. It got an archtop panel, which was liked at this time very much indeed. Here's an old favourite of mine. I love this type of chair, but I can't think of anything much more uncomfortable. Tiny little triangular shaped seat, probably crib from Scandinavia. A massive turning at the back, sometimes called a throne chair, not where the Queen would sit on, but thrown in the sense of a man throwing a vase in pottery. A turned or thrown chair, and my word, that's not just been cleaned to come in this studio. Someone has looked after that for many, many, many years. And here's a chair again, not quite like it started, I think. Italian design here with this crossover frame. Here there would be no wood showing at all. Would be tightly stuck on the red silk damask or the velvet all over. So it became just a covered X-frame chair, and well, there's a certain amount of comfort there because there'd be 2 or 3 cushions on the webbing on the seat. And here you can remember a few moments ago we talked about the linenfold panelled chest. There's almost one there where a man has said, well, let's make it a bit more comfortable. People sit on them. Put 2 very crude arms and just a bit of linenfold, carved linenfold panelling at the back. So turns in his mind a chest into a settle. And these things were beginning to happen. So was this. Here's a chest I've known for many years. It stands in the hall at Berkeley Castle. It's called Drake's chest. Nothing about it except it's made in cypress wood, again probably from Italy. A lovely wood this. Has the properties of dispelling moth and beetles and everything else. You could put rich vestments in here, rich gowns, and they'd be kept free. And this has got just a simple plain top, but because the thing has been shut for so many years, this lovely painting underneath here, all these beautiful men of war, where you can nearly see them, you know, the Armada steaming up the channel. But that is a beautiful bit underneath there. And here's a cupboard, known today as a court cupboard, probably a misnomer because a cupboard at this time was a cup board. It was a plain board on which cups stood, and they sometimes came in 1 and 2 tiers, still on which cups stood, with no cupboards at all. And later then you get a little cupboard, as it were, cocked in here. Sometimes they go up with pillars and you get more cupboards. But it's 50 to 100 years before you get a cupboard completely enclosed by doors. This one's rather nice, called a court cupboard, but there is this little business about knowing exactly what is the right word to call it. And here is a non-such chest. Yes, if you guessed it was, you're absolutely right. Any sort of chest in England of this age which is inlaid with architectural marquetry like that immediately is called a nonsuch chest, in memory of that nonsuch palace built by Henry VIII at Cheam. It's believed really by most people, and I believe that to be quite true, that it is just some architectural marquetry more than a drawing, as it were, of this palace. Because you've only got to see anything like this and you say, oh, the nonsuch palace. No such palace as this, said Henry VIII. And look, perhaps that is a bit of it, because there's the dear old chap's portrait. So, we've talked about nearly everything. In fact, the only one thing that we've never mentioned, of which there were many of, was beds. Look at this. A bed of about 1600, although by the design of it, it certainly looks more to me like a bed of Henry VIII's time. You see, it has these curious straight posts, cut like they are there, and the tester, the cornice, carved with vertical flutes around it. And the rest of the bed is then made up with panelling, quite small panels here, the headboard and the tester, all panelled. You notice the size of the panels, mortised and tendoned together and pegged, but small panels. They get larger and larger in Queen Anne's time, but not now. And of course, this is not, strictly speaking, a four-poster. A four-poster bed is what it says up on 4 posts. This tester is supported on these 2 end posts and on the headboard. And later on comes in massive posts here with big bulbous supports, and the headboard is reduced by quite half, and then 2 more posts are added, and we get the later 4-poster beds which run on right into the 18th century. And of course, not only would this bed be like this, but completely covered. When anyone had gone to bed, they pull these heavy curtains round, great thick velvet curtains, keep out the draught and everyone else, because it is a fact they were not all in bedrooms as such. They were in large rooms almost all over the house. And when you went in to something like this and really enclosed yourselves, you were really on your own.
Arthur, thank you very much. Well, as you know, you can't really talk about furniture, and beds in particular, without mention of the great bed of Ware, which incidentally was referred to by Sir Toby Belcher in a speech in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. There it is, and it really is some bed. It's 10 feet 8 inches wide, it's 11 feet long, and it said it could accommodate 8 couples at the same time. However, we won't go into that. But if you'd like to see the bed for yourself, it's at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and well worth looking at, not only because it's unique through its size, but also because it's typical of the marvellous boldness of expression of the Elizabethan period. Well, next week in our programme, we move into the 17th century. We look at the Jacobean period and the Restoration. And until then, from Arthur and me, goodbye.
An intriguing story of missing treasures. How did ancient artefacts simply disappear? Shadow World, Thief at the British Museum. Listen on BBC Sounds.